Hey there, Drowsy Historian here. Tonight we're travelling to feudal Japan, a land of sliding screens, silent courtyards, and rules so old no one dares question who wrote them. Behind the elegance of lacquered wood and embroidered silk lies a system of obligation and control where sex was not a matter of intimacy, but of structure. Wives were chosen, courtesans purchased, monks forbidden, and servants never asked. Before we begin this long, slow descent through tatami rooms and lacquered lies, do me one small favour. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. And if you'd prefer these stories without ads or interruptions, you can join the Patreon. It's linked in the description. Also, if you're listening in bed, consider a weighted blanket. They're warm, grounding, and, unlike a 17th century husband, they rarely sigh when you shift beneath them. I've linked the one I use below. Now, lie back, get comfortable. Let's begin. In the quiet stillness of early evening, a household in Edo settles into itself. Tatami mats soften the footfalls of those who remain indoors. The last light of the day filters through washi paper screens, pale and gold and fleeting. Somewhere in the inner room, incense has been lit. The faint scent of sandalwood curling upward, trailing along the beams like a breath held too long. Doors slide closed with the dry hush of cedar on cedar. Outside the street is not loud, only muffled. The clop of gator on packed earth, the distant creak of a cart, a voice that rises only halfway through a sentence, before disappearing behind a shutter. The house is neither grand nor poor, and its rituals are as unremarkable as they are absolute. In a place like this, expectations are not spoken aloud. They do not need to be. Everyone knows where to be. Everyone knows how to behave. Everyone knows what is owed. This is feudal Japan, not a single moment, but a long, shifting stretch of time in which the body was rarely one's own. From the Kamakura period to the last decades of the Tokugawa shogunate, sex in Japan was shaped not by personal yearning, but by political necessity, religious caution, and a rigid architecture of social roles. To speak of it as an act of intimacy would be to misunderstand its function entirely. Intimacy was incidental. What mattered was lineage, control, propriety, harmony, in the most brittle, performative sense of the word. Even pleasure, when permitted, was filtered through structure, paid for, legislated, or disguised as poetry. Those who found moments of real desire did so carefully, and almost always at risk to themselves or someone else. At the foundation of this order was the IE, or household unit, not simply a family, but an enduring legal structure meant to survive across generations. Within the IE, sex was a mechanism for preserving bloodlines, forging alliances, or reinforcing the authority of the head of house. Marriages were arranged, children expected, inheritances secured. For the vast majority of people, especially women, sex was a duty one entered into under direction, not desire. The notion of love as a guiding principle would have been laughable in most households, and actively dangerous in others. There were, of course, exceptions, but they are just that, exceptions. The structure did not account for affection. It accounted for continuity. To understand sex in this context is to understand that it rarely occurred in isolation. It was always seen, not necessarily in the physical act, but in its consequences. A woman's body might be observed in her swollen belly, her absence from the firewood chores. The scroll hung discreetly outside her room to signal rest. A man's desirability might be measured in the quality of his partner, the fertility of his children, or the rumour that he spent too much time near the pleasure quarter. Monks were expected to abstain. Soldiers were expected to indulge discreetly. Servants were expected to obey. These expectations were not merely cultural, but codified, in law, in practice, in custom. Even silence, that most enduring of Japanese virtues, was part of the framework. What was not said still carried weight. What was not acknowledged could still destroy a reputation. There was no universal experience. The expectations placed on a nobleman's daughter differed sharply from those faced by a fisherman's wife. A geisha, a peasant, a Buddhist nun, all occupied distinct positions within a deeply layered society. Yet across these divisions, one common thread ran true. Sex was not private. It did not belong to the individual, but to the role they played. A woman might sleep beside her husband for 20 years and never speak of her own desire. A man might frequent a courtesan for months before ever calling her by her real name. Entire lives could pass in rooms where the floor was spotless, the gestures were practiced, and no one ever admitted what they truly wanted. And beneath it all, the tatami endured, quiet, clean, unyielding. Historical records from the period, what few exist, tend to be male, elite, and official. They speak of lineage, of scandal, of fertility and disgrace, but rarely of affection. What we know of everyday erotic life comes mostly from fragments, court cases, manuals, poetry, and the occasional diary. What emerges is a picture that is neither puritanical nor indulgent, but something else entirely, something structured, bounded, and always contingent on status. This was not a society that feared sex, it was a society that feared disorder. Passion was not suppressed because it was sinful, it was suppressed because it was unpredictable. And unpredictability, in a culture built on hierarchy and appearance, was a threat. The Kamakura period laid many of the foundations. As the samurai class rose to dominance, so too did a rigid moral code, one influenced by both Confucian ideals and a militarized sense of discipline. Sexual discretion became a form of loyalty. A wife's fidelity was a mark of her husband's honor. A servant's silence could determine her survival. In the Muromachi era, the lines between duty and indulgence began to blur, especially among the upper classes. Poets wrote of longing. Courtesans developed reputations for wit as well as beauty. But even these flourishes remained contained. The Tokugawa shogunate would codify control in its most intricate form, with legal codes that specified everything from acceptable marital conduct to the regulation of licensed pleasure districts. It was, in many ways, the culmination of a centuries-long project, the transformation of sex into structure. By the height of the Edo period, entire cities had been organized around visibility and discretion. Samurai lived by strict codes. Artisans worked long hours to afford brief escapism. Merchants, growing wealthier but barred from certain privileges, turned to lavish entertainment as compensation for social exclusion. And in every neighbourhood, expectations governed who could visit whom, at what hour, through which entrance, and for how long. A young woman walking unaccompanied could find herself judged for a glance too long. A man found with a lover, not his wife, might lose not just reputation, but livelihood. Privacy was rare, but secrecy was cultivated. The two are not the same. Language, too, reflected the architecture of concealment. Euphemisms abounded, not crude, but lyrical. Manuals might describe the act of crossing clouds or visiting the hidden chamber. Diaries refer obliquely to shared evenings or delicate appointments. Even pornography, which existed in woodblock prints and scrolls, often paired graphic imagery with poetic titles, a kind of double performance, both blunt and veiled. This was not necessarily out of prudishness. It was a reflection of layered communication, a culture that prized what was implied over what was stated. In such a world, the ability to suggest without declaring became a form of power in itself. Silence became not merely a social tool, but a survival mechanism. A wife whose husband strayed could not protest without appearing improper herself. A concubine who gained favour had to navigate the jealousy of others with perfect humility. A servant coerced into intimacy was expected to continue serving breakfast as if nothing had occurred. The more painful the truth, the more carefully it was folded away, like a stained garment hidden at the bottom of a lacquered chest. This was not unique to Japan, of course, but the form it took, structured, ritualized, and passed off as harmony, was distinct. None of this is to say that people did not feel affection, or pleasure, or longing. They did, and sometimes they acted on it. But such actions occurred within a narrow corridor of possibility, hemmed in on all sides by rank, duty, and consequence. A samurai might take a lover, but only if it did not interfere with service. A priest might bend his vows in secret, but only if he remained outwardly devout. A farmer's daughter might dream of someone she could never approach. A courtesan might fall in love with a client she could never keep. These moments were real, but they were not free. As the incense burns lower and the screens remain shut, one truth settles in like dust beneath the floorboards. For most people, in feudal Japan, sex was not an expression of self, but a performance of role. And like all performances, it required an audience, even if that audience was only the judgment of one's ancestors, or the quiet surveillance of the neighbourhood. To step outside the role was not merely frowned upon, it was destabilising, and the system did not tolerate destabilisation. Which brings us to marriage, not as a romantic institution, but as an architectural fixture of social control. For most people, the first experience of sex did not arise from attraction or flirtation, or even curiosity. It came from arrangement, a family meeting, a contract signed, a futon laid out in a room too quiet for questions. In the world that now awaits us, sex begins not with desire, but with instruction. If you were a farmer's daughter in feudal Japan, your wedding might take place before you fully understood what was being signed. There would be no lavish ceremony, no flowing white garment, no tearful toast from a parent too emotional to speak. More likely, there would be a quiet agreement struck between households, a shared drink to seal the arrangement, and the expectation that by the next morning you would no longer be living in the same home, nor sleeping in the same bed. You might be 14, possibly younger. He might be 10 years your senior, or 20. If you were lucky, he wouldn't be cruel. But that was not part of the negotiation. What mattered was that your families had reached consensus, that the names aligned, the property lines remained stable, and the rice yields promised harmony. Marriage in feudal Japan was not a union of hearts. It was a contractual tethering of households, a transactional formality designed to uphold the IE, the family system that structured Japanese society from top to bottom. The IE was not about individual happiness. It was about the endurance of a lineage, the passage of land, honour, name, and blood through time. The head of the household, usually male, bore legal and moral authority over all subordinates within it, including wife, children, and servants. His choices shaped not only his own family's fate, but the public reputation of his ancestors. To marry well, or at least to marry advantageously, was a responsibility, not a pleasure. Among the aristocracy, marriages were often sealed with dowries, land transfers, or strategic political promises. A noble woman's body was not hers to give. It was a conduit through which alliances were cemented. Her marriage might elevate her father's standing, secure a brother's future, or guarantee continued favour from a superior lord. Whether she liked her husband, or even met him before the wedding, was not especially relevant. The match had been chosen for her, usually by a father, sometimes by a guardian, and occasionally by someone even more distantly related, whose influence outweighed proximity. On paper, she was a wife. In practice, she was often a hostage for peace, Among commoners, the motives were less strategic, but no less transactional. A farmer might seek a wife to bear children who could work the fields. A merchant might marry into a family with a better market stall or a favourable tax standing. A craftsman might wed the daughter of his former apprentice, provided she came with sturdy hands and the capacity to stretch millet into porridge. In some cases, affection did blossom, but that was considered a fortunate accident, not a prerequisite. Romantic compatibility was not the goal, mutual obligation was. Marital age varied considerably, depending on class, region, and era. Among the samurai and aristocracy, girls could be married as early as 12, though consummation might be delayed for a few years. Boys might marry slightly later, often in their mid-teens, depending on when they could prove themselves financially or politically viable. Among commoners, especially in rural areas, the average age crept up slightly. Women might marry in their late teens, men in their 20s, though economic desperation could hasten the timeline considerably. In families with many daughters, marriage could be a method of reduction, one fewer mouth to feed, one more tie to a neighbouring rice plot. Love had little to do with the timing. Hunger often had more. Consent, as modern audiences understand it, was not part of the equation. A daughter's willingness might be considered in theory, especially if her father were unusually indulgent or had multiple candidates to choose from. But her refusal would rarely carry weight. In some households, a daughter might be beaten into submission. In others, she might be scolded, ignored, or simply escorted to her new home before she had time to protest. The structure of the IE granted parents near total authority over the fate of their children, especially daughters. To object too loudly was to risk family dishonour, a charge far more damaging than private distress. Daughters learned early that obedience was not optional. It was expected. It was survival. Once married, a woman's legal identity all but dissolved into that of her husband's family. She became part of their IE, subject to its head, often her father-in-law. Her duties were clear: manage the household, produce children, and maintain propriety. Her virtue reflected on the entire lineage. If she failed to bear a son, she might be replaced. If she was suspected of infidelity, she could be returned, disgraced or worse. Divorce, while technically possible, was not common. A man could issue a letter of divorce for any number of reasons: infertility, disobedience, poor household management, but a woman's avenues for complaint were nearly non-existent. In rare cases, a wife might flee back to her natal family and plead her case, but doing so publicly risked shame for everyone involved, especially her parents. Silence was safer. Men, meanwhile, were granted far greater freedom, both socially and legally. While a wife was expected to remain chaste and devoted, a husband's infidelities were often tolerated, even normalised, provided they did not disrupt household order. Visits to the pleasure quarters were not necessarily signs of moral failing. They could be interpreted as stress relief, as economic patronage, or as a simple indulgence. The contradiction was rarely acknowledged. It did not need to be. The structure absorbed it. Even the act of marriage itself varied in formality. Among aristocrats and samurai, marriage might be marked by an official ceremony, documentation, and the presence of both families. Among peasants, it might involve little more than moving in together, with the community's tacit recognition functioning as validation. In some regions, local custom carried more weight than written law, but regardless of form, the underlying expectations remained the same. The household must continue, the name must be preserved, the woman must serve. This was not merely cultural, it was reinforced by law. The Tokugawa shogunate implemented detailed household codes that outlined proper conduct, filial obedience, and the punishment for deviation. Women were encouraged to uphold the 3 obediences: to father before marriage, to husband during marriage and to son after a husband's death. Education, when permitted, focused on domestic skills, moral instruction, and comportment. Some women wrote poetry, a few ran businesses, but most were expected to remain in their roles, visible, dignified, and silent. Children born of these unions became the next generation of roles to be filled. A son might inherit the household. A daughter might be married off in turn. If no male heir was available, families might adopt a son-in-law, a practice known as mukoyoshi, to ensure continuity. In some cases, particularly in merchant families, daughters could inherit businesses or property, but only if no other options existed. Even then, they were expected to marry quickly and pass that authority to a husband. Autonomy was not denied outright, it was simply circumvented. None of this is to suggest that affection between spouses was impossible. It occurred, sometimes gradually, sometimes not at all. But even in the best of cases, affection had to coexist with structure. A husband might grow fond of a wife, who bore him sons and kept his household in order. A wife might come to respect a husband who did not beat her, who allowed her to manage the kitchen budget in peace. Fondness could grow from familiarity. Mutual tolerance could, over decades, come to resemble companionship. But the institution itself was never built to nurture love. It was built to protect inheritance. The pressure to marry was not equally distributed. For women, marriage was the expected endpoint of girlhood. For men, it was one option among many, depending on their class, wealth, and social ambitions. Some men delayed marriage in favour of travel, study, or debauchery. Others married early and treated their wives as formalities. A few remained unmarried by choice or circumstance and found comfort elsewhere, in brothels, among concubines, or in the arms of someone less official. The legal system allowed for it. The household structure absorbed it, and society, by and large, turned its gaze elsewhere. Indeed, many men were not content with what marriage offered. The strictures of household life, especially for the upwardly mobile, could feel stifling. A wife chosen by one's parents might lack allure. The demands of lineage might preclude intimacy. The fantasy of escape, of indulgence without consequence, persisted. And in a society as hierarchical as Edo Japan, that fantasy found form, carefully regulated, handsomely taxed, and dressed in silk, which leads, inevitably, to the world of licensed desire. When marriage became duty, men looked elsewhere for performance. Not all of them could afford it, but those who could often did, with the state's quiet blessing. If you were a low-ranking samurai, with just enough coin and not enough prestige, you might slip into Yoshiwara under cover of dusk. The gate would be discreet, but not hidden. The streets would narrow just slightly before opening into a carefully orchestrated spectacle of music, perfume, and flickering lantern light. It would not feel illicit. It would feel practiced. That was the point. The Tokugawa authorities understood something that every frustrated husband, every unambitious son, and every lonely clerk also understood. Desire does not disappear simply because it is inconvenient, and if it cannot be removed, it must be managed. Yoshiwara was management, legal, visible, taxable management, where fantasy could unfold beneath the illusion of silken civility. Established in 1617 by official decree, Yoshiwara was the most famous of several government-sanctioned pleasure quarters in Edo, Japan. It was not a brothel, in the narrow sense of the word, but an enclosed district, physically walled off from the rest of the city, where prostitution, entertainment, and carefully controlled debauchery were allowed to flourish under supervision. Other cities had their own equivalents, Shimabara in Kyoto, Shinmachi in Osaka, but Yoshiwara became emblematic of the system. Glamorous, self-contained, and utterly artificial. Its streets were laid out geometrically, its gates locked at night, and its residents, entertainers, servants, managers, and women for hire, were bound by rules as strict as any monastery. The district operated under a tightly controlled hierarchy. At the top were the oera, elite courtesans renowned not just for their beauty, but for their education, artistic skill, and command of social ritual. These women could compose poetry, perform music, and carry on multi-hour conversations about literature, history, and fashion. They were not simply purchased for an hour. They were courted over weeks or months. A patron wishing to spend the night with an oiran was expected to make multiple formal visits, send gifts, and pass through several layers of gatekeeping. Only the wealthiest and most persistent clients ever made it to the inner rooms. Even then, the courtesan retained the right, at least nominally, to refuse. This semblance of autonomy was part of the fantasy. Beneath the oiran were layers of other workers, tsukemawashi, apprentices, yujo, general prostitutes, and at the very bottom, kashi, street-level women whose names were rarely recorded and whose bodies bore the full weight of the system's neglect. Some worked in shabby back rooms, others waited near the district's outer wall, offering quick encounters for a fraction of the cost. They were not educated, they were not admired, but they were tolerated, because even the poorest man might want to pretend he was desired, and even the richest man might grow bored of etiquette. Yoshiwara and its sister districts functioned as what sociologists would now call safety valves, sanctioned spaces for the release of pressure. In a society built on rank, hierarchy, and constraint, the pleasure quarters allowed men to perform the fantasy of freedom. A low-ranking samurai could pretend he was a poet. A struggling merchant could be addressed with exaggerated reverence. A clerk who had never touched a musical instrument in his life could be serenaded as if he were a patron of the arts. It was theatre, but everyone knew their role. The courtesan was not in love. The client was not a genius. The walls were thin, and the debts were recorded. Still, the illusion was worth the coin. Importantly, the system was not only permitted by the state, it was engineered by it. Tokugawa authorities, keen to prevent unrest among the growing urban population, saw the regulation of vice as preferable to its prohibition. The logic was straightforward. If desire could be contained in specific districts, it would not infect the rest of society. If men had somewhere to indulge their impulses, they would be less likely to challenge the rigid norms of family and class. And if these indulgences could be taxed, and they were, heavily, then the state would profit, both financially and politically. The pleasure quarters were not a crack in the structure. They were part of the structure. Women who worked in Yoshiwara were not simply free agents. Most were sold into the system as children or adolescents, often by impoverished parents, hoping for some form of upward mobility. A girl might begin her career as a servant or an apprentice, trained in the arts of conversation, music, and bodily presentation. With enough skill and luck, she might rise to become a named courtesan. But even the most successful remained bound by contract. Debt was a constant. Clothing, makeup, housing, and training were all charged to the woman's account, meaning that years of work could pass without ever seeing a coin that truly belonged to her. Escape was rare. Retirement, rarer still. Some women died in service, others faded into obscurity, married off to minor clients, or sent to the countryside to vanish without ceremony. Despite this, the official narrative of the pleasure quarters emphasized sophistication, artistry, and allure. Guidebooks were printed featuring idealized portraits of popular courtesans, complete with poems, anecdotes, and fashion notes. Tourists visited Yoshiwara not only for carnal pleasure, but for the spectacle, the lanterns, the parades, the suggestion that one had stepped into a world apart from everyday drudgery. The entire experience was curated, much like a theatrical performance, where desire was rehearsed, refined, and commodified. A client did not merely pay for sex, he paid to be seen paying for it. The illusion of romantic possibility was carefully maintained. Clients were encouraged to believe that their chosen courtesan favoured them above others, that a deeper connection might one day emerge, that their presence was somehow exceptional. The courtesans, for their part, were trained to suggest just enough intimacy to keep the illusion alive, but not so much as to threaten the structure. Actual emotional attachment could be dangerous, not only for the women, but for the system itself. A courtesan who fell in love might attempt to break her contract. A client who became obsessed might abandon his household responsibilities. When these scenarios did occur, and they did, they were treated as tragedies, moral lessons, or occasionally farce. Outside the licensed quarters, unregulated prostitution also thrived. Less glamorous, more desperate, and often more dangerous. Street workers operated on the margins of legality, frequently arrested, fined, or forced into short-term contracts in sanctioned districts. Some worked independently. Others were controlled by intermediaries who took most of the earnings. Few had protection, fewer had recourse, and none had the social cachet of the named courtesans. Their existence was tolerated when convenient and erased when inconvenient. They were not written into poetry. They were not remembered by name. The experience of the client, meanwhile, varied dramatically by class. A wealthy merchant could afford extended stays, elaborate gifts, and repeat visits. A minor official might save for months to afford a single evening. A samurai could be both honoured and resented, depending on his behaviour. Etiquette was expected. Even in a space built on performance, breaches of decorum were not taken lightly. A man who drank too much, who spoke too coarsely, who treated a courtesan as less than the illusion required, he might find himself denied entry, mocked behind closed doors, or quietly blacklisted. Power was relative, even here. Not all encounters were physical. Some clients came only to talk, to drink, to be listened to. Loneliness, after all, has many forms. The courtesans understood this. They were, in many ways, archivists of male insecurity, keepers of secrets, flatterers of fragile pride, and quiet witnesses to the gap between duty and desire. They knew when to speak and when to fall silent. They knew how to lean just slightly forward when listening. They knew how to laugh at the same story for the third time, with the same polite interest. For many, the act itself was the least demanding part of the job. Art from the era reflects this complexity. Shunga, erotic woodblock prints, often depict explicit scenes, but they are not mere pornography. They are detailed, sometimes comedic, and occasionally surreal. Bodies are exaggerated, expressions are stylized. The prints were meant to titillate, yes, but also to amuse, to educate, and to perform. They were purchased by men and women alike. Some served as marital guides, others were private indulgences. Like the pleasure quarters themselves, they occupied a liminal space, neither fully respectable nor entirely hidden. They were part of the same cultural choreography. The state's relationship to all of this was pragmatic. Officials did not pretend that prostitution did not exist. They simply ensured it remained where it belonged, inside the district, behind the gates, beneath the lanterns. The boundaries were literal. Yoshiwara's gates closed at dusk and opened at dawn. Clients could enter, but not leave during the night. Courtesans could not exit without permission. This physical separation served as both protection and prison. It kept vice visible but contained. It maintained the fiction of moral order. For men, the pleasure quarters represented escape from marriage, from duty, from the rigid roles imposed by birth and rank. For women, there were no equivalent districts, No sanctioned spaces where desire could be safely explored or indulged. Female sexuality was regulated through silence, chastity, and subservience. A woman who wandered the streets alone could be assumed to be a prostitute, even if she was not. A wife who confessed dissatisfaction risked disgrace. A daughter who pursued her own interests could be married off more quickly, silenced by obligation. The contrast was not merely cultural, it was structural. The illusion that men could choose their desires and women could only endure them was central to the entire system. And while courtesans and geisha might have appeared powerful within their narrow spheres, their influence depended entirely on male interest, male money, and male permission. A courtesan without clients was not a woman of leisure, she was a burden. A wife who expressed no interest in her husband's wandering eye was not liberated, she was simply fulfilling her role. The walls of Yoshiwara did more than separate pleasure from propriety. They drew a line between who could pay to be seen and who could not afford to speak. And on the other side of those gates, beyond the lantern light and practiced smiles, lived the women who had no outlet at all. Only duty, silence, and the long, unrecorded erosion of desire. If you were a merchant's wife, you were expected to be many things: silent, modest, endlessly available, and eternally faithful. You were the keeper of the household accounts, the manager of domestic affairs, the quiet guardian of your husband's reputation. You were not to raise your voice in public, nor speak too freely among guests. Your robes were to be elegant, but not ostentatious. Your demeanour was to reflect both discipline and devotion. Most importantly, your virtue was to remain unquestioned, not merely preserved, but visible, confirmed daily by the neatness of your home, the discipline of your children, and the dull predictability of your movements. Desire, if it lived in you at all, was assumed to be dormant. Anything more would have been considered dangerous. The moral expectations placed upon women in feudal Japan were shaped by a careful fusion of Confucianism, Buddhist restraint, and patriarchal practicality. Confucian thought, imported and adapted from China, provided the ideological scaffolding for a system in which a woman's worth was measured primarily by her obedience. She was to serve her father in youth, her husband in marriage, and her sons in widowhood, a triad of submission known as the three obediences. This was not merely a matter of custom, it was moral law. A woman's virtue was not hers to possess. It was her family's to protect and her husband's to enforce. In public records and household manuals alike, female sexuality was treated as a latent threat, one that had to be carefully managed, confined, or suppressed. The double standard was institutional. Men were allowed, even encouraged, to seek pleasure beyond their homes, provided it did not disrupt their obligations. Women, by contrast, were not merely discouraged from doing the same, they were punished. Adultery committed by a woman was considered a violation of the household, an act of betrayal so severe that it could warrant divorce, disinheritance, or execution. The legal codes of the Tokugawa period were explicit. A wife caught in infidelity could be put to death by her husband, sometimes with no trial required. In practice, the punishments varied from formal repudiation to silent exile, but the message was consistent. A woman's body was not hers. It was a vessel of honour, and if it was found wanting, the shame was not hers alone, but her family's. The fear of female sexual agency extended well beyond the act of adultery. A woman who laughed too freely, who spent too much time unaccompanied, who dared to show interest in a man outside her station, could be labelled improper. Reputation was fragile. A single misstep could unravel an entire household standing. Mothers trained daughters from an early age to be cautious, composed, and quiet. The danger was not in desire itself, which was rarely acknowledged, but in its consequences. A woman who acted on her wants risked more than disgrace. She risked social annihilation. Reproductive autonomy, too, was largely absent. A woman's role as childbearer was central to her value, and her ability to conceive, particularly son, Toti, was seen as both duty and destiny. Fertility was a household concern. A barren wife might be replaced, supplemented with a concubine, or quietly set aside. Her body was examined, questioned, and sometimes blamed for failures that lay elsewhere. There was no room for ambivalence. Childbirth was not merely expected, it was assumed. Pain, injury, or death in the process were treated not as tragedy, but as collateral. The lineage had to continue. That was the purpose. Pregnancy outside of marriage, meanwhile, could be catastrophic. For an unmarried woman, a child was a permanent mark of disgrace, not just for herself, but for her parents, her siblings, her entire community. In such cases, the pressure to conceal or eliminate the evidence could be overwhelming. Infanticide, while officially condemned, did occur, particularly among the poor, where another mouth to feed could tip the balance from survival to starvation. Midwives and older women sometimes assisted in secret. The shame was shared, but the burden fell on the mother alone. Within marriage, decisions around reproduction were rarely made by the woman herself. The timing of pregnancies, the spacing of children, even the option of abstinence, all were subject to her husband's preferences. Contraceptive methods existed, but they were rudimentary and unreliable. Abstention, withdrawal, herbal pessaries, or post-coital rituals. None of these could be implemented without either the man's cooperation or the woman's extreme caution. The body, again, was not private, it belonged to the structure. The silence surrounding female desire was not total, but it was culturally reinforced. Women's diaries, where they survive, rarely speak directly of lust or longing. When they do, the tone is cautious, often cloaked in metaphor or poetry. A glance across a garden, a dream left unfinished, a letter burned before dawn. These fragments offer only glimpses, and even those are rare. More often, desire is filtered through duty, affection for a husband expressed in terms of gratitude, the joy of children described as fulfillment, the absence of complaint treated as virtue. Popular literature of the Edo period occasionally explored female desire, but almost always in the form of cautionary tales. A woman who strays is punished. A woman who falls in love outside marriage suffers. Even comedic or erotic works depict female longing as impulsive, irrational, or destructive. The message is consistent. The woman who desires is the woman who disrupts. And disruption in a Confucian system is not liberation. It is failure. Education for girls reinforced this model. While some daughters of elite families received instruction in calligraphy, poetry, or the management of household finances, moral education always took precedence. Manuals like Honor Daigaku, Greater Learning for Women, outlined the principles of obedience, modesty, and restraint. Girls were taught to lower their gaze, to move quietly, to defer in conversation. They were trained to embody virtue, not as an abstract ideal, but as a daily performance. Their success as wives would be measured not by happiness, but by harmony. Their failure would not be forgiven. Physical expression, too, was curtailed. The way a woman walked, sat, dressed, and styled her hair all conveyed her status and her virtue. A married woman might blacken her teeth and pluck her eyebrows in accordance with fashion, not to attract but to signal. A courtesan might wear bright colours and elaborate hairstyles. A wife would not. Even within the confines of home, a woman's appearance served as a kind of communication. The body spoke, but not freely. Buddhism, though officially tempered by state regulation, reinforced many of these expectations. Women were seen, in much of Buddhist teaching, as spiritually inferior, further from enlightenment, more prone to distraction, and in need of purification through rebirth as men. This theological hierarchy translated into social norms. A woman's sexuality was not only suspect, it was seen as an obstacle. In some temples, women were forbidden to enter certain sacred spaces. In others, they were accepted only as donors, servants, or symbols of worldly attachment. The tension between spiritual purity and bodily reality created yet another layer of silence, one where even faith did not provide escape, and yet desire did not vanish. It simply retreated into dreams, into poems, into silence. A wife might find herself drawn to a neighbour, a childhood friend, a visiting merchant. She might bury that feeling beneath ritual, beneath duty, beneath layers of propriety so dense that even she could no longer name it. A young girl, promised in marriage to a man she had never met, might imagine something different, not necessarily better, but less predictable. A widow, freed from the expectations of her youth, might remember what it felt like to be wanted. None of these thoughts could be spoken aloud, but they were not imaginary. Where did these unspoken desires go? Not into rebellion, there was no space for that. Not into confession, there was no one safe to hear it. Not into resolution, the structure did not permit it. Desire for women in feudal Japan was often a quiet undoing. Not dramatic, not tragic, just slow, a fading behind the screen, a silence mistaken for contentment, a life lived in accordance with expectation, and never once named aloud. And if silence failed, if longing refused to die, some women turned toward religion. Not because it offered pleasure, but because it offered erasure, a place where desire could be dissolved into ritual, replaced with purity, masked as piety. In the temple, as in the home, the body was never truly free, but at least the rules were different. If you joined a Buddhist temple to escape the world's demands, you may have found those demands followed you inside the gate. The robes may have been simpler, the days more structured, the walls high enough to muffle the clamour of village life. But the human body did not disappear simply because doctrine asked it to. Inside the monastery or convent, one was expected to pursue enlightenment through self-discipline, austerity, and the renunciation of worldly attachments. That included sex. In theory, the rule was clear. In practice, it was more porous than anyone admitted. Buddhism, as it developed in Japan, brought with it a deep ambivalence about the body. The spiritual ideal was detachment, from desire, from sensation, from ego. Monks and nuns were expected to shave their heads, adopt modest clothing, live communally, and abandon sexual relationships entirely. Sexual activity, according to canonical texts, distracted the mind, sullied the body, and tethered the soul to the cycle of rebirth. Enlightenment required transcendence, and transcendence, it was believed, could not be reached while one was still busy indulging the flesh. The monastic codes, Vinaya, laid out strict prohibitions against all sexual conduct. For monks, even the touching of a woman's hand could warrant disciplinary action. For nuns, the expectations were even more severe. They were expected not only to abstain but to live in a state of near total submission to male clerics, to elder sisters, to the rhythms of the cloister. In exchange, they were promised spiritual advancement, stability, and the relative protection of religious space. But while the rules may have been absolute on paper, reality seldom aligned. Concubinage among monks was common, especially in smaller temples removed from major centres of oversight. A village monk might share his home with a housekeeper who cooked his meals, tended his laundry, and unofficially shared his bed. Such arrangements were understood by the community, quietly accepted, and rarely spoken of unless scandal erupted. Some monks even fathered children, though these were often passed off as nephews wards, or disciples. In larger temples, discretion was enforced more rigidly, but even then, rules bent under pressure. Wealthy patrons, political alliances, and personal ambitions could all distort the boundaries of celibacy. Temple hierarchies mirrored secular ones. Senior monks held authority not only over rituals and doctrine, but over the daily lives of junior members. Abuse of this authority, including sexual coercion, was not unheard of. In such cases, the power imbalance rendered consent functionally irrelevant. A novice who resisted might be disciplined for disobedience. A victim who spoke out might be expelled for defaming the institution. The structure protected its own image. The silence it cultivated was less a symptom of devotion than of survival. Not all relationships were exploitative. Some were quietly affectionate, romantic even, within the narrow privacy permitted by temple walls. Monks formed bonds with one another, with female patrons, with former lovers who now lived nearby. These relationships were rarely acknowledged publicly, but they persisted nonetheless. Letters, poems, and gifts changed hands. Eyes lingered longer than permitted. Even in a space built for renunciation, the human heart remained irreverent. Among the aristocracy, entering religious life was often a strategic decision rather than a spiritual calling. Second sons who would not inherit family lands were sent to monasteries to reduce competition. Daughters whose marriages would be too costly, or who had fallen from political favour, might be placed in convents for appearance's sake. For these individuals, the temple was less a refuge than a holding pen, a space in which to remain useful, disciplined, and visibly virtuous. The expectations of chastity still applied, but the enforcement varied depending on status, connections, and proximity to political scrutiny. For noble women, entering a convent could provide rare access to education, independence, and community. Within these walls, they might study classical literature, calligraphy, or Buddhist texts. They might serve as abbesses, oversee temple finances, and receive guests. Some even played roles in local governance, but these privileges came at the cost of autonomy. A nun's sexuality, like her lay counterparts, was meant to disappear. If she formed attachments, they had to be buried beneath ritual and routine. A pregnancy would mean expulsion. A rumour could end a career. The threat was not always enforced, but it was always present. Convents, like monasteries, were dependent on outside patronage for survival. Wealthy families might endow a temple in exchange for prayers, burial rites, or spiritual merit. In some cases, the abbess herself would be a member of the donor family, placed there to maintain influence while projecting piety. These relationships could blur lines. A patron might visit often, linger in conversation, develop attachments. A nun might welcome the attention, resent it, or endure it. Whatever she felt, she would not speak of it. Silence was part of the uniform. The physical layout of monastic life was designed to enforce separation. Male and female temples were distinct. Sleeping quarters were isolated. Rituals occurred at prescribed times. Meals were taken in silence. These routines were meant to quiet the mind, to reduce distraction, to prepare the spirit for detachment. But routine is not immunity. Boredom bred restlessness. Restlessness sought company. And in a structure where the private body was treated as both irrelevant and suspect, that very body became an object of heightened awareness, not for pleasure necessarily, but for control. Not all violations of celibacy occurred within religious walls. Monks and nuns interacted regularly with the secular world. They performed funerals, presided over festivals, advised the dying, and mediated family disputes. They travelled, petitioned, and politicked. In doing so, they encountered villagers, patrons, former acquaintances. Temptation did not require orchestration. It required only proximity, a shared meal, a returned glance, a memory that refused to fade. The contradiction between ideal and reality was well known. Jokes about monk concubines appeared in popular literature. Satirical poems mocked the gap between sacred vow and secular behaviour. Paintings depicted lecherous clergy with exaggerated features, fondling women or drunkenly falling from horses. These were not merely criticisms, they were acknowledgements. Society understood that the ideal of celibacy, while noble in theory, was nearly impossible in practice, and often hypocritical in its enforcement. Still, the structure endured. Violations were punished when politically convenient. Scandals erupted, were contained, and eventually forgotten. The institution of Buddhist celibacy persisted not because it was universally honoured, but because it remained symbolically valuable. A monk who broke his vows might be scorned, but the robe he wore still commanded respect. A nun who bore a child might be exiled, but the temple she once led would still receive donations. The ideal served the system. The system tolerated deviation, provided it did not draw too much attention. Among lay people, the perceived purity of clergy remained important. Monks were called upon to bless homes, write charms, and mediate spiritual concerns. Their chastity gave weight to their words. Nuns were expected to model virtue for young girls, to instruct them in modesty and restraint. Their reputations became tools for social instruction. Whether the individuals behind the roles lived up to them mattered less than the performance. The illusion of discipline, of serenity, of detachment had to remain intact. There were exceptions. Reformers occasionally rose within the religious ranks, calling for stricter enforcement, for a return to doctrinal rigour. Some succeeded, at least for a time. Others were sidelined, quietly ignored or removed. Change was difficult in an institution so closely tied to the social order, and as with all forms of power, those most invested in preserving the status quo were rarely the ones expected to live by its strictest rules. The tension between spiritual aspiration and physical reality shaped not only the lives of individual monks and nuns, but the cultural landscape of feudal Japan as a whole. Temples were more than places of worship. They were landowners, employers, educators, and political actors. They mediated between heaven and earth, purity and corruption, restraint and indulgence. And in doing so, they reflected the society around them, a society that praised self-denial while quietly permitting indulgence, that idealized chastity while institutionalizing double standards. Celibacy in this world was not merely a vow, it was a story told to maintain authority. A robe could shield its wearer from scrutiny, or expose them to it, depending on their rank, gender and luck. A temple gate could offer sanctuary, or trap one in silence. A doctrine could free the mind, or bind the body. For those who entered religious life to escape the demands of society, the discovery that those demands had followed them inside, changed costume perhaps, but not content, must have been quietly devastating. Still, religion offered one rare advantage: erasure. A woman placed in a convent, a man cloistered in a distant temple, could be removed from the marriage market, from scandal, from public shame. Their desires, their histories, their reputations could be folded into silence, not healed, not answered, simply hidden. In a society where so much was built upon performance, the temple offered a stage where the lines were fewer, though the audience never truly left. But not everyone was interested in renunciation. For those who remained in the secular world, particularly among the aristocracy, sex was not denied. It was arranged, leveraged, and often weaponized. Where the monk wore his vows as armour, the courtier wielded desire as strategy. If you were the second daughter of a minor noble house, you might be sent to serve in a daimyo's household, not as a wife, but something close. You would arrive with folded silks, a careful smile, and the knowledge that your presence was transactional. You were not there to inherit, to rule, or to be adored. You were there to ensure harmony, to reinforce an alliance, to give birth to someone whose name would not carry yours. Your family might speak of duty, the head servant might speak of obedience, the man you served might say very little at all. Still, your position was considered honourable, provided you kept quiet, bore no scandal, and knew your place. Concubinage in feudal Japan, particularly among the elite, was a formal institution, legally sanctioned, socially recognised, and politically strategic. While a daimyo, or high-ranking samurai, might have a principal wife, chosen for him by family arrangement, he was also entitled to keep concubines, secondary women who served both domestic and reproductive functions. These women were not prostitutes. They were not hidden mistresses. Their roles were defined within the household hierarchy, often with assigned rooms, attendants, and specific responsibilities. They did not dine at the main table, but they were not absent from the records. Their presence was visible, if not always acknowledged. The arrangement benefited the male line. With multiple women under one roof, a powerful man could increase his chances of producing heirs, solidify ties with multiple allied families, and display his wealth through the size and elegance of his retinue. The concubines themselves, however, existed in a liminal space, neither wife nor servant, present but secondary. Some were daughters of allied families, exchanged as a form of soft diplomacy. Others were elevated from lower ranks within the household, or drawn from families who could not afford a more advantageous marriage. Their consent was not required. Their future was not their own. The principal wife held official status, often reflected in ceremony, clothing, and the right to participate in formal affairs. But her position was not always secure. If she failed to produce a son, or if a concubine bore a particularly favoured child, tensions could arise. A clever concubine with a healthy boy could gain influence beyond her station. A jealous wife could petition for a rival's removal. The politics of the inner household were every bit as complex as those on the battlefield, though their weapons were subtler. Gossip, alliance, favour, and silence. These domestic rivalries were not confined to the imagination. Letters, court records, and even poetry from the period speak of the quiet wars waged between women of the same household. Alliances were formed between attendants, secrets were passed beneath screens. A spilled ink pot, an offhand remark, a misdirected letter, these could all tilt the balance of power. And yet, despite the manoeuvring, the shared constraint remained the same. None of these women were free to leave. Their lives were bound to the will of a man who might favour one today and another tomorrow, whose moods governed access to resources, whose death could render all of them redundant. Polygyny, the practice of one man keeping multiple wives or concubines, was not universally practiced, but it was widespread among the upper classes. It was seen not as indulgence but as strategy. Each additional woman represented another link in the social chain, another opportunity to secure loyalty or produce a politically valuable child. The prestige of a household was often reflected in the number and rank of its women. A powerful man might keep 3 or 4 concubines without drawing comment. 10 or 12 was not unheard of, particularly in earlier periods or in more autonomous domains. The structure absorbed them all. For the women involved, however, the experience was far from glamorous. Space, time, and access were all rationed. A concubine might go weeks without seeing the man to whom she was bound. She might spend her days embroidering robes that would never be worn, instructing servants who did not respect her, or caring for children who would be taken from her as soon as they were old enough to be educated. Her influence, when it existed, was fragile, dependent on youth, fertility, and the whims of others. The moment her usefulness faded, she could be dismissed, married off to a lower-ranking retainer, or quietly transferred to a religious institution. There would be no formal farewell. Her name might not appear in the family registry. Her life would simply shift, as silently as it had begun. Male sexual privilege in this system was not questioned. A man's ability to take multiple partners was seen as natural, even beneficial. His behaviour might be judged if it disrupted household order, but rarely for the act itself. A woman, by contrast, had no corresponding rights. She could not keep lovers. She could not leave one man for another. Her fidelity was not just expected, it was essential to the legitimacy of her children. The entire system of inheritance depended on the assumption that a wife or concubine bore only the children of her designated partner. Any deviation from that assumption was treated as betrayal, scandal, or madness. This imbalance was reinforced through law, custom, and ritual. Household manuals outlined the proper conduct of wives and concubines, emphasizing obedience, restraint, and diligence. Educational texts warned women against jealousy, gossip, or complaint. Elders counseled young brides to serve their husbands, other women with humility, to prioritize harmony over emotion. Even religious institutions participated in the moral instruction, encouraging self-denial as a path to spiritual merit. There was no equivalent burden placed on men. Their indiscretions could be explained as stress, strategy, or simply nature. The gap was not hidden. It was institutionalized. Children further complicated the dynamic. A concubine who bore a son might see her status rise, though the child's inheritance rights would vary depending on household rules. Some principal wives raised the sons of concubines as their own, particularly if they had no biological children. Others refused, creating lifelong resentments and divisions within the family. Daughters were married off, often at younger ages, and with fewer prospects than the sons of principal wives. The hierarchy extended into the next generation, ensuring that the distinctions between women, wife, concubine, servant, would be replicated in their offspring. Despite these constraints, some women wielded considerable power within the system. A favoured concubine might influence appointments, steer alliances, or manage temple donations. A politically savvy wife might broker marriages, host emissaries, or act as regent in her husband's absence. These exceptions, however, did not alter the rule. Their power was always mediated through their relationships to men. Autonomy, when it appeared, was temporary. Influence was earned, but never guaranteed. The language used to describe these women reflected their ambiguous status. Terms like makake, concubine, and koi, secondary consort, appeared in household records, but were rarely used in conversation. Instead, euphemisms prevailed. The inner room, the lady's chamber, the gentle flower. These phrases obscured the transactional nature of the arrangement, cloaking it in poetic delicacy. The women themselves were expected to maintain the illusion. Complaints were discouraged. Rivalry was to be hidden. Even childbirth was treated as a matter of ritual more than biology, performed behind curtains, attended by women, and announced with prescribed phrases. The body, once again, was not personal. It was political. Portraits from the era often show concubines and wives posed demurely, their hands folded, their eyes averted. The ideal was not charisma, but containment. A woman who spoke too freely, laughed too loudly, or moved too confidently might find herself corrected, not with violence necessarily, but with exclusion. She might be passed over for gifts, denied access to her child, assigned poorer quarters. Punishment did not have to be overt to be effective. In a system built on attention, being ignored was a form of discipline. What agency existed came in small, often unrecorded acts. A concubine might withhold information. A wife might delay a message. A servant might exaggerate a story. These gestures rarely changed the outcome, but they shaped the experience. They allowed women to claim, if not control, then at least narrative. The stories they told themselves, and each other, became a quiet form of resistance. Even if the world outside the sliding screens remained unchanged, the space between them could be navigated with care and sometimes with subtle defiance. None of this should be mistaken for empowerment. The structures these women navigated were not designed for them to thrive. They were designed for men to consolidate power, produce heirs, and maintain appearances. That some women learned to maneuver within those limits is a testament not to the fairness of the system, but to their endurance within it. A concubine who rose through the ranks did so by learning the rules faster than her rivals. A wife who retained favour into old age did so by sacrificing privacy, pride, and sometimes affection. Their success was not freedom. It was continuity under constraint. Outside the walls of noble households, the picture was even starker. For the majority of women in feudal Japan, farmers, servants, fisherwomen, vendors, there was no title, no ceremony, and no record. If they were coerced, no one wrote it down. If they were discarded, no one remarked on it. Their experiences with sex, marriage, and motherhood were shaped not by the elegance of court, but by the weight of necessity. And unlike the wives and concubines of powerful men, they had almost no power to refuse. If you were a housemaid in a wealthy samurai home, your body was not your own. It belonged to the silence of the walls. You would rise before dawn to light the lamps, to sweep the floors with practiced discretion, to prepare rice and miso for a family whose names you never said, unless asked. You would bow without being acknowledged, wait without being thanked, and smile when addressed in the clipped tone reserved for the lower classes. Your hands would remain folded when spoken to, your eyes cast downward, your presence so careful it might be mistaken for absence. You were not expected to be clever, or desirable, or even memorable. You were expected to be there, and not there, until the moment someone wanted more. Domestic service in feudal Japan operated within a system so deeply hierarchical that the very concept of personal agency, particularly for women, became irrelevant. Servants were not merely employees, they were dependents, bound by obligation, ritual, and the unspoken understanding that proximity to power did not confer protection. For a young woman working in a samurai household, sexual access was not necessarily negotiated through words or promises. It was implied by structure. A lord who summoned a maid to his chamber did not need to explain himself. A son who cornered a servant in the corridor would rarely face reprimand. The household would not speak of it, the girl would not speak of it, the order of things would remain. Consent, in this context, was a concept that held little cultural weight. The servant class, particularly women, were not regarded as possessing full moral or social autonomy. Their status rendered them perpetually vulnerable, not only to the whims of their employers but to the blind spots of the law. Tokugawa legal codes, while extensive in other domains, offered limited recourse for servants who were assaulted or coerced within the home. Even when regulations theoretically protected them, enforcement was rare, and testimony from a low-status woman against a high-ranking man was easily dismissed. The burden of proof was insurmountable. Silence was safer. This silence was not only expected, it was enforced through shame, dependency, and isolation. A maid who spoke out might be accused of seduction. A nursemaid who resisted might be replaced without explanation. A kitchen girl who cried too often might be scolded for disrupting harmony. The architecture of domestic service was designed to erase dissonance, to ensure that the household ran smoothly, regardless of what occurred behind closed doors. The servants' quarters were tucked into the rear of the compound, their bedding thin, their voices hushed, their private grievances folded into the communal hush of long corridors and sliding doors. Suffering did not interrupt the routine. It was part of it. This system of control extended across gender and age. Male servants too were vulnerable to abuse, though the forms it took varied, and the cultural narratives surrounding it were even more obscure. In larger households, young male attendants might be subjected to the desires of their masters under the guise of mentorship or privilege. These relationships, when acknowledged at all, were framed not as violations but as traditions, structured hierarchies of closeness that blurred the lines between affection, power, and use. The servant's compliance was assumed. His resistance, if it occurred, was reframed as insolence. He could be dismissed, humiliated, or simply ignored. The consequences belonged to him, not to the one who acted upon him. Among female servants, the pressure to remain silent was compounded by economics. Wages were minimal. Many workers sent a portion of their earnings back to their families, who relied on the coin regardless of how it was earned. To lose a position due to scandal, or even one where the worker was the victim, could mean financial ruin, not just for the individual, but for her relatives. A mother might counsel her daughter to be careful, but not to complain. A sister might share quiet warnings about which doors to avoid, which footsteps to fear, which requests were not truly optional. These small acts of survival passed between women in whispers, while the system around them remained unchanged. Occasionally, a servant who became pregnant might be sent away to a cousin in the countryside, to a shrine, to a bathhouse far from the city. The child, if born, would not bear the father's name. The girl might be allowed to return, provided she kept quiet and the matter remained unspoken. In some cases, she would not return at all. Her disappearance would be noted only in the reassignment of her duties. The room she had swept would be swept by someone else. Her shoes would be moved. The routine would continue, unbroken. The dry horror of these arrangements lay in their normalization. No one had to announce what was permitted. The rules were unspoken, but omnipresent. Girls who learned them early might avoid the worst. Girls who did not might find themselves blamed for their ignorance. The household, outwardly serene, relied on this balance of service, discretion, and the careful erasure of discomfort. A guest entering through the front gate would see polished wood, tasteful screens, and graceful movements. They would not see the bruises. They would not hear the silences that followed laughter. They would not think to ask. Literature from the era occasionally alludes to these dynamics, though always obliquely. In household tales and moral dramas, the servant girl is often portrayed as either seductress or victim, but rarely as a full person. Her suffering is instrumental, a plot device to test the virtue of others, or a cautionary note to warn against ambition. She is rarely named. Her thoughts are not explored. Her exit, when it comes, is tidy. The fiction mimics the structure, neat, silent, and unresolved. Yet the servants were not entirely passive. They developed their own strategies for survival: quiet refusals, calculated obedience, the careful cultivation of favour with kinder members of the household. Some aligned themselves with older women who could offer protection. Others learned to disappear at just the right moment. Still others, facing limited choices, leaned into the expectations placed upon them, feigning affection, acquiescing quickly, securing small comforts in exchange for larger indignities. None of these strategies were liberating, but they were adaptive, and in a system where refusal often meant ruin, adaptation became the closest approximation of agency. The rare stories of a servant marrying into the family, elevated from labour to official partner, were circulated more as fantasy than precedent. They reinforced the idea that obedience could be rewarded, that suffering might be transformed into security. In reality, such outcomes were vanishingly rare and came with their own forms of subjugation. A former maid who became a wife still bore the burden of her origins. Her in-laws might never accept her. Her children might be quietly reminded of her past. And her husband, if he had once treated her as property, was unlikely to change his view. Despite all this, domestic service remained one of the few viable options for women of lower status. It offered food, lodging, and the promise, however fragile, of stability. For some, it was a stepping stone to marriage with another servant, to modest savings, to the management of a kitchen or bathhouse. For others, it was a sentence, an endless repetition of tasks, gestures, and silences that slowly eroded the sense of self. And always, just beneath the surface, was the understanding that the body could be claimed without warning and without consequence, that any kindness might be a prelude. That survival required performance. The cultural refusal to recognize consent within these dynamics was not the result of ignorance, it was the result of design. The structure of feudal society depended on the assumption that people stayed in their place, not just physically, but morally. A servant who spoke of abuse challenged the fiction that the household was harmonious. A maid who resisted risked appearing disloyal. The system could tolerate cruelty, but not disobedience. It could overlook violence, but not disruption. Silence, then, became more than compliance. It became currency. And yet silence could not fill the stomach, nor could it clothe a child, or pay a dowry, or restore lost years. For some women, those who had been dismissed, displaced, or simply worn down, the boundaries between service and transaction began to blur. If the body would be used regardless, why not profit from it? If desire could be endured in silence, could it also be sold? If obedience brought only exhaustion, could performance bring coin? It was a question that led many to leave the kitchens and corridors of private households for a different kind of labour, not necessarily safer, but more overt, where a man's gaze might still possess, but at least his coin was visible, where silence was still required, but the transaction was named, where the illusion of choice, however fragile, was preferable to the certainty of being taken. If you were a woman with no dowry and a sharp enough wit, you might learn to play the shamisen and become what the poets called a courtesan, and what your mother called a warning. You would learn to dress in silks so bright they shimmered even in candlelight. You would learn to speak just enough, laugh just so, and conceal your hunger behind layers of elegance. Your name would not be your own. Your history would be rewritten by stagecraft. And if you were very, very good, men would line up to pay for the privilege of being lied to, gently, beautifully, and with practiced melancholy. This was the floating world, or ukiyo, a term used to describe the licensed entertainment districts that flourished in urban Japan during the Edo period. It referred not just to geography, places like Yoshiwara in Edo, Shimabara in Kyoto, and Shinmachi in Osaka, but to a state of mind, detached from our daily burdens, immersed in ephemeral pleasure, drifting like a petal on a stream. The courtesans, geisha, and entertainers who inhabited this world were not simply sex workers. They were performers, artists, and illusions. Their power was not in their bodies, but in the distance they maintained. Close enough to be admired, never close enough to be kept. The divide between courtesan and prostitute, between geisha and yujo, was rigid but often misunderstood. High-ranking courtesans, such as the oiran, were trained from a young age in music, poetry, etiquette, and calligraphy. They memorized lineages, read classical texts, and mastered the art of conversation. They could charge exorbitant fees, not only because of their beauty, but because of the social status they conferred upon their patrons. A man seen entering the quarters of an oiran gained distinction, not unlike commissioning a famous painter or funding a temple. The encounter was a performance, scripted, deliberate, and slow. Physical intimacy, if it occurred at all, came only after a lengthy courtship involving gifts, poems, and proper introductions. The illusion of romance was essential. By contrast, lower-tier workers, often referred to simply as yujo, offered their services more directly. Many had little or no training in the arts, no family backing, and no illusions about advancement. They worked in cramped quarters, endured harsh conditions, and were frequently subjected to disease, violence, and neglect. Some had entered the trade voluntarily, seeking income when other paths closed. Others had been sold into it by desperate families or tricked by contracts they could not read. Their labour was invisible in the cultural imagination, even as it formed the backbone of the red light economy. The floating world celebrated the oiran. It did not write poems about the women in the back rooms. Somewhere between these categories were the geisha, entertainers who were not, at least officially, sex workers at all. Geisha trained in dance, music, conversation, and theatrical presence. They performed at tea houses, accompanied wealthy men to private events, and embodied a kind of aesthetic ideal that emphasized refinement over allure. Their profession was strictly regulated, and sexual transactions were explicitly forbidden by law. Though enforcement varied and ambiguity persisted, a geisha who became a patron's lover might be discreetly supported or quietly dismissed, depending on the arrangement. But the myth of the geisha as an elite courtesan, a trope perpetuated in foreign writing, obscures the real boundaries and tensions of the role. Geisha sold company, not intimacy. Their work was proximity without possession. To speak of choice in this context is to speak carefully. Some women entered the floating world with eyes open, drawn by the promise of independence, glamour, or escape. But many were pushed by poverty, circumstance, or familial pressure. The courtesan's silk robe concealed not just her legs, but the ledger that tracked her debt, for training, for clothing, for food, for the room she slept in. Years of labour might never clear it. A courtesan who aged, fell ill, or lost favour could be discarded without compensation. A younger girl might be assigned to replace her before the ink on the dismissal dried. The system rewarded youth, obedience, and performance, and punished those who faltered. Performance in the floating world was not limited to the stage. Every interaction was choreographed. The way a woman poured sake, the way she laughed at a joke, the pace at which she walked, all were part of the act. Even moments of intimacy were stylized. A courtesan might pretend to be shy, reluctant, overcome, or she might feign passion with such skill that the client believed it, if only for a moment. The illusion of emotional engagement was often more valuable than the act itself. The courtesan's body was not just an object of transaction, it was a prop in a narrative written by expectation. Clients, for their part, were often willing participants in the fiction. A merchant might spend a month's income to sit in the presence of a celebrated courtesan, listening to her play shamisen and sipping tea that tasted of rose petals and restraint. A samurai might recite poetry and imagine that his verses stirred real affection. The floating world offered a kind of emotional theatre, a place where men could enact roles of power, tenderness, or vulnerability without consequence. The women who performed for them had to manage not just their appearances, but their patrons' egos. A misplaced glance, a misjudged tone, could cost repeat business. Pleasing a client did not mean pleasing his body. It meant preserving his illusion. Popular woodblock prints, ukiyo-e, often depicted courtesans in moments of quiet beauty, combing their hair, arranging flowers, writing poems. These images emphasized elegance, solitude, and refinement. They did not depict the long hours of waiting, the rituals of grooming, the exhaustion of forced laughter. Nor did they show the bruises, the unwanted touches, the tears wiped away before a client arrived. The floating world was beautiful, in print. In practice, it required constant vigilance. Some women did achieve limited autonomy. A highly successful courtesan might negotiate the terms of her retirement, buy her freedom, or secure a wealthy patron willing to sponsor her exit. A geisha might open her own house and train younger performers. These outcomes were rare and often romanticized after the fact. Most women remained in the system until they were no longer profitable, at which point they were married off to minor clients, reassigned as housekeepers, or abandoned. Their names, once printed in guidebooks, faded quickly from memory. Their portraits were replaced by younger faces. The floating world had no room for permanence. Romantic narratives persisted nonetheless. Stories of courtesans who fell in love with clients, or clients who renounced wealth for a courtesan, were popular in theatre and fiction. These tales followed familiar arcs: devotion, sacrifice, tragedy. They served as both fantasy and caution. A woman who gave her heart risked ruin. A man who fell too deeply lost face. The moral was always clear: desire must remain within its boundaries, and those who crossed them paid the price. For the women of the floating world, desire was not personal. It was rehearsed, repackaged, and sold by the hour. A courtesan did not kiss for pleasure. She kissed when the price was right, when the script required it, when the client expected it. If she felt longing, she buried it. If she felt revulsion, she masked it. The mask was part of the contract. The truth was irrelevant. Emotion, like silk, was tailored to fit. The distinction between performance and personhood blurred over time. A girl who entered the profession at 12 might spend her formative years inhabiting someone else's voice, someone else's smile. By the time she was 20, she might no longer remember what it meant to speak unfiltered. Even her private thoughts, rehearsed for imagined conversations, bore the cadence of artifice. The mask did not come off at night. It settled into the skin. And yet, behind all this calculation and structure, desire still flickered. Not the transactional kind, not the feigned kind, but the quiet, human kind that slipped past the cracks. A glance held too long. A song played too slowly. A client remembered not for his coin, but for his kindness. These moments were rare and rarely safe. If discovered, they could lead to punishment, dismissal, or worse. But they were real, even when unspoken. The floating world was not free of emotion. It was saturated with emotion that had nowhere to go. What made this structure bearable for some, or at least survivable, was the company of other women. Relationships formed between courtesans, between geisha and attendants, between girls in training and their older mentors. These bonds were complex, part friendship, part alliance, part shared endurance. Some were affectionate, some became intimate. The presence of same-sex relationships in the floating world is difficult to document. Not because it was absent, but because it was rarely recorded. The official scripts made no space for women who desired women. Their bodies were staged for the male gaze. Their affections were erased by default. Still, hints remain. In poems exchanged, in letters preserved, in oral traditions passed down among geisha houses. A woman might fall in love with her teacher. A courtesan might share a bed with her companion and call it convenience, even as her hands lingered too long. These desires existed outside the structure, not forbidden exactly, but invisible. And in a system that demanded constant performance for male attention, the possibility of unguarded intimacy, however fleeting, was both dangerous and quietly precious. But where, in this elaborate architecture of performance, illusion, and transaction, did these desires belong? Where could they safely live? The answer, more often than not, was nowhere. If you were an adolescent page in a samurai household, you might find yourself sharing more than just your lord's tea. You would serve him with quiet attentiveness, folding his robes, preparing his sword, kneeling beside him as he ate. You would listen to his instructions, laugh when appropriate, and never speak first. Your presence would be respectful, your hands clean, your eyes lowered. But there were glances you would learn to recognize, touches that lingered longer than routine required, moments in the stillness of night when the gestures became different. In public, you were a servant. In private, you were something else. Not quite a lover, not quite a possession, but claimed all the same. Same-sex relationships in feudal Japan were neither unknown nor uniformly condemned. They existed in a cultural and historical context, distinct from modern categories of identity. Among samurai, Buddhist clergy, and certain artistic circles, romantic or erotic relationships between men, particularly between an adult and a younger male, were both visible and at times ritualized. This practice, known as nanshoku, or male colours, occupied a paradoxical space, morally ambiguous, aesthetically idealized, and socially conditional. It was not a matter of identity so much as of role, age, and form. Among the warrior class, nanshoku relationships followed a structured dynamic, often based on age and hierarchy. A senior partner, typically an older samurai or lord, would take a younger companion, usually a page or squire in his teens. The older partner was expected to provide mentorship, protection, and in some cases, affection. The younger was expected to be loyal, obedient, and physically available. These relationships were described in literature and historical chronicles as bonds of deep emotional and even spiritual intimacy. Loyalty forged through shared danger. Affection expressed through ritualized closeness. They were rarely permanent. The expectation was that once the younger partner reached adulthood, the relationship would fade and give way to marriage or other adult obligations. Despite the formalized structure, nanshoku was not entirely removed from genuine feeling. Diaries and poems from the period speak of longing, jealousy, heartbreak. One samurai might lament a former lover's coldness, another might write verses mourning a fallen page. These expressions were not necessarily shameful. In some cases, they were celebrated as demonstrations of refined sensibility, but the emotions involved remained bounded by status and performance. A samurai could love a page, provided the love maintained the proper tone. Public displays of passion, breaches of rank, or attempts to sustain the relationship beyond its accepted span could invite ridicule, censure, or worse. The Buddhist clergy also had a long and uneasy relationship with nanshoku. Monastic life, in theory, required celibacy. In practice, however, monasteries often became sites of covert, and sometimes open, same-sex relationships. Young acolytes brought into the temple for religious training sometimes became objects of desire for senior monks. As with the samurai, these relationships were often framed as mentorships, with the sexual component either discreetly ignored or reframed as an expression of affection. Buddhist texts occasionally condemned such behavior, but enforcement was inconsistent. In some periods, temple authorities turned a blind eye. In others, they issued edicts, removed offenders, or staged public purges. The contradiction between doctrine and practice was never fully resolved. Among the arts, particularly in the world of kabuki theatre, gender and desire became even more fluid. Male actors, known as onagata, who specialized in female roles, were admired not only for their skill, but for their androgynous beauty. Off-stage, these performers were sometimes objects of male desire, pursued by patrons, protected by lovers, or exploited by managers. The distinction between actor, courtesan, and partner could become blurred. The kabuki stage was one of stylized transformation, where men became women with grace and precision. But the bodies behind the illusion remained vulnerable, especially for younger actors. Fame did not always protect them. In some cases, it attracted attention that could not be refused. The fascination with androgyny was not limited to the theatre. In literature and art, the blurred line between masculine and feminine was often depicted as alluring, mysterious, or divine. Beautiful youths with delicate features appeared in woodblock prints, scrolls, and novels. Some of these figures were idealized lovers. Others were tricksters, ghosts, or moral examples. What mattered was the ambiguity. Desire could exist in liminal spaces, so long as it remained within aesthetic and narrative control. Female same-sex relationships, by contrast, were far less visible in the historical record. This was not necessarily because they were less common, but because they were less acknowledged. Women's sexuality, as discussed in earlier sections, was already constrained by silence, erasure, and moral strictures. Intimacy between women was often dismissed as friendship, overlooked as harmless, or ignored altogether. In some cases, it may have been tolerated precisely because it was considered inconsequential, outside the structures of inheritance, politics, and public reputation that governed male relationships. But invisibility is not the same as safety, and erasure does not equal acceptance. In convents, female relationships may have developed under the protection of seclusion. Among geisha and courtesans, emotional bonds between women were common, though the extent to which these became romantic or erotic is difficult to determine. The records that survive often speak in euphemism: shared sleeping mats, exchanged poems, quiet devotion. Without explicit acknowledgement, these relationships remain speculative, but their existence, hinted at in margins and side notes, suggests that desire found expression even when it could not find recognition. The legal system of the Tokugawa shogunate was ambivalent about same-sex relationships. Laws against unnatural acts existed in theory, but were rarely enforced unless tied to scandal, disruption, or other breaches of social order. A quiet relationship between a lord and a page might pass unnoticed. A public altercation, a jealous outburst, or an attempt to formalize the bond could trigger intervention. As with many things in Edo society, discretion mattered more than doctrine. The system was less interested in private behavior than in the appearance of harmony. Still, the risk was real. For individuals without status, protection, or powerful allies, accusations of sexual deviance could be devastating. A servant discovered in a same-sex tryst might be beaten or dismissed. A monk exposed in scandal might be defrocked. A kabuki actor involved with the wrong patron might disappear quietly, the incident blamed on illness, travel, or divine retribution. Punishment did not always arrive as law. Sometimes it arrived as rumour. Sometimes it wore the face of silence. Despite this, the language of same-sex desire persisted. In art, in poetry, in coded references passed between friends or lovers. A glance, a gesture, a double meaning in a verse. These forms of communication allowed desire to exist in the cracks of the system, invisible to those who did not know where to look, unmistakable to those who did. The tradition of Nanshoku literature, while stylized, served as both preservation and camouflage. It offered legitimacy to relationships that would otherwise have no name. It also reinforced hierarchy and ritual, reminding its readers of the rules even as it explored what broke them. The interplay between desire and taboo in feudal Japan was not a battle between repression and liberation, but a constant negotiation of appearance, status, and survival. Same-sex relationships existed, but not as identity. They were roles, phases, arrangements, navigated through performance, obscured by structure, permitted until they were not. There were moments of tenderness, of passion, of heartbreak, but these lived alongside risk, denial, and the ever-present demand to remain unseen. What makes these histories difficult to reconstruct is not their rarity, but their deliberate concealment. The lives of those who loved outside the structure were rarely recorded unless they disrupted it. And when they did, they were remembered as cautionary tales, not as people. Their stories survive in fragments: a dismissed servant, a scandalous monk, a vanished actor, never quite whole, always just out of reach. The desire was real. The punishment was close behind. For all that desire could slip through the cracks, punishment often came in through the door, dressed not in shame or passion, but in paperwork. Laws, codes, accusations, penalties. The system may have been flexible in its tolerance, but it was precise in its enforcement when its thresholds were crossed. Harmony had rules, violation had consequences. If you were caught in a scandal, you might not face shame. You might face steel. The law in feudal Japan was not designed to protect innocence or seek truth. It was designed to preserve order. What mattered was not the interior life of the accused, but the appearance of disruption. Harmony in Tokugawa society was not a condition, but a performance. And when the performance broke, the consequences were swift, public, and often fatal. Adultery, for instance, was not merely a private failing. It was a breach of the household, a threat to lineage, a potential disruption to the inheritance of property. For women, the legal consequences were severe. A wife caught in an affair could be divorced instantly, cast out of the home, or executed, not metaphorically, but literally. Under Tokugawa law, a husband was entitled to kill both his wife and her lover if caught in the act. In practice, many did not, but some did, and those who did were rarely punished. The law recognized the crime as a defense of honor, not an act of violence. Men, predictably, were not held to the same standard. A husband who strayed might be scolded, especially if his behavior disrupted his household or offended a superior, but rarely faced legal repercussions. Male infidelity was viewed as unfortunate, not criminal, unless it interfered with duty or provoked a political scandal. Even then, punishment tended to be administrative: reassignment, temporary dismissal, or the quiet revocation of privileges. The system was not blind to male transgressions. It simply absorbed them more gently. The crime of rape or gokan was treated with bureaucratic ambivalence. Officially, it was illegal. Unofficially, it was difficult to prove. The law required evidence of physical resistance or injury, meaning that victims who submitted out of fear or coercion often had no legal standing. A woman who reported rape without visible bruises could be accused of lying. A servant who accused her employer could be dismissed outright. A wife who accused her husband had no legal case at all, since conjugal rights were assumed and unspoken. The burden of proof was placed not on the accused, but on the injured. Silence was often the only safe outcome. When prosecutions did occur, the punishments varied wildly depending on status. A commoner convicted of rape might be paraded through town in shame, flogged, or even executed. A samurai might face house arrest, a forced apology, or a transfer to a less prestigious post. The law, while codified, bent easily beneath the weight of rank. A victim's testimony might be taken seriously only if she came from a reputable family, had male witnesses, and had nothing to gain from the accusation. And even then, conviction was rare. Abortion, known as datai, existed in a shadowed corner of the legal system. Technically illegal, under most interpretations of Tokugawa law, it was nonetheless widely practiced, particularly among the poor. Herbal remedies, pressure techniques, and prayer rituals were employed quietly by midwives and wise women who understood that another mouth to feed could mean starvation for all. The authorities looked away unless death resulted, and even then, punishment was inconsistent. Among samurai families, abortion was scandalous, not because of morality, but because of its implications for succession. A lost child could mean the end of a line, the collapse of an alliance, or the humiliation of a husband. The issue was not the body, it was the family name. Infanticide, or mabiki, literally thinning out, was another open secret. In rural areas where famine was frequent and infant mortality already high, the selective killing of newborns was sometimes practiced as a grim form of population control. Girls were more likely to be victims than boys, especially in families with limited resources and no sons. Methods varied: suffocation, exposure, drowning. The act was often performed by older women in the household, not out of malice but out of grim necessity. The authorities occasionally cracked down, but more often turned a blind eye, especially when the family in question owed taxes or labour. The death of a child, unrecorded and unnamed, preserved the structure that mattered more. The differentiation between sin and crime was fundamental. A sin might be moral, a violation of religious or ethical principle, but unless it disrupted social order, it was not the business of the state. A crime, by contrast, was anything that disturbed the appearance of propriety. A man could abuse his wife without consequence unless she died. A woman could suffer daily humiliation in silence, but the moment she raised her voice, she risked punishment for insubordination. The system was less concerned with justice than with continuity. Law was not applied in pursuit of fairness. It was applied to keep the lines of power intact. Public punishments served as reminders. Executions were carried out in central squares. Criminals were paraded through streets with placards describing their crimes. Stocks, beatings, and exile were used to humiliate as well as correct. The spectacle mattered more than the sentence. People needed to see the consequences. They needed to be reminded that the system functioned, not evenly, not fairly, but predictably. Those at the bottom saw punishment as caution. Those at the top saw it as confirmation of their immunity. Samurai, by virtue of their rank, were granted special privileges under the law. A samurai who killed a commoner, even unjustly, might avoid punishment entirely if he could claim a violation of status. If a peasant failed to bow deeply enough or speak with proper humility, the samurai could draw his sword with impunity. These incidents were not daily occurrences. They would have undermined public stability, but the possibility was real and understood. The threat of sudden violence, sanctioned by law, reinforced hierarchy without needing to be enacted often. When samurai were punished, it was often through ritualized means such as house arrest or enforced seppuku. Ritual suicide meant to restore personal and family honor. This was not leniency exactly, but it did allow for a certain aesthetic of dignity. A criminal commoner might be hung or beheaded. A disgraced samurai might be permitted to die, kneeling in white robes, his crime recorded, but his name preserved. The legal system offered these distinctions as part of its structure. Justice for the many, grace for the few. Women, particularly those of lower classes, had no such recourse. A maid accused of seduction might be whipped, banished, or sold. A prostitute who violated the rules of her district could be imprisoned or forced into harsher labour. A concubine who caused scandal might be quietly removed, her fate unrecorded. Their bodies were not protected by law. They were shaped by it, and when necessary, erased by it. The dry horror of enforcement lay in its efficiency. There were no dramatic speeches, no lengthy trials. Testimony was often oral, witnesses unreliable, paperwork minimal. Punishments were swift and symbolic. A man accused of adultery might be made to stand barefoot in the cold. A woman accused of abortion might be questioned in private, then dismissed without ceremony. The sentence was not always physical. Sometimes it was a reassignment, a rumour, a quiet end to a contract, but the impact was lasting. Guilt was irrelevant, evidence was flexible. What mattered was containment. Even when one escaped formal punishment, survival did not guarantee dignity. A woman acquitted of a crime might still be barred from marriage, her name whispered in disapproval. A man whose misconduct was overlooked might find himself quietly demoted, relocated, or ignored by former peers. Reputation lingered longer than record. In a society so obsessed with appearances, rumour was more enduring than law. The stain of suspicion could last a lifetime, regardless of what had been proved or disproved. For those who lived on the edge, the poor, the powerless, the socially expendable, the law functioned less as a guide and more as a sword. It was not impartial. It was not blind. It looked precisely where it was told to look, and struck with exacting force when order was threatened. There were no appeals. There were no exceptions, unless one had the rank to purchase them. The rules were clear. So were the consequences. And yet, people continued to transgress. Not out of rebellion, but out of need. Hunger, desperation, desire, none of these bowed before statutes. A woman who sold herself did so, because there was no other path. A servant who kept silent did so because the alternative was worse. A lover who reached for someone forbidden did so not in ignorance, but in full knowledge of the risk. The law did not prevent these acts. It simply punished them quietly or publicly when the timing was right. Even the innocent, or the legally exonerated, could find themselves marked. Law might spare the body, but it rarely protected the person. The social consequences of accusation, investigation, or association were enough to destroy reputations, end marriages, and erase futures. The law was a blunt instrument, and it did not care what was true. It cared what was orderly. So even when one survived the courtroom, the inquiry, the village whispers, even then the cost remained. The body endured, the status endured, but dignity did not always follow. In a world where law was structured to preserve structure, not fairness, it was often the survivors who carried the heaviest burdens. And those burdens did not end at the courtroom gate. They followed the accused home, into marriages that now looked different, into households where children asked questions that went unanswered, into a society that knew how to forget without forgiving, into bodies that still bore the consequences, physical, reproductive, psychological. Because what the law left behind, the body was expected to carry. If you were a wife, your primary value wasn't how you pleased your husband, but whether you could produce a son. That son would inherit the name, the house, the land, and the quiet obligation to continue the line. You were not merely a companion, you were a vessel of continuity. Your fertility was not a private matter, it was a communal concern. Your husband's family would watch you carefully for signs, missed cycles, morning nausea, swelling under the layers of silk. A successful pregnancy would earn you temporary favour. A failed one might earn you suspicion. In the rigid framework of the II, the household system, reproduction was not a matter of intimacy. It was architecture. Children were the beams and cornerstones of that structure, and women were the labourers who built it. A wife who gave birth to a healthy son secured her position, at least for a time. A wife who produced only daughters might be tolerated, but never celebrated. A woman who bore no children at all risked replacement. The role she filled had no room for ambiguity. Inheritance did not bend for affection. Childbirth in feudal Japan was dangerous common, and treated with a kind of resigned fatalism. Women gave birth at home, assisted by midwives or older female relatives. There was no anesthesia, no antiseptic, and little understanding of infection. Complications were frequent: breech births, hemorrhaging, retained placentas. Mortality rates were high, particularly for first-time mothers and those in rural areas. Stillbirths were mourned quietly. Maternal deaths were grieved with equal restraint. A woman who died in childbirth had fulfilled her duty, even if it killed her. Her name might be recorded in the family ledger, or it might not. For elite women, the risks were no less real, but the surroundings were more elaborate. A noble woman might give birth in a specially prepared room, with charms hung from the rafters and monks summoned to chant protective sutras. Her pain would be managed through ritual, not medicine. Her privacy would be minimal. Attendants would report progress to the family. If the baby cried, relief. If the mother bled too long, regret, followed swiftly by arrangements for a second wife or a concubine to take her place. Inheritance required continuity. Sentimentality was secondary. Miscarriage, while less visible than childbirth, carried its own weight. A woman who miscarried might be blamed for overexertion, for dietary failure, for emotional imbalance. Remedies and taboos abounded. Avoid cold water. Do not sweep too early in the day. Abstain from certain foods. These prescriptions offered the illusion of control in a process that remained deeply unpredictable. A woman might endure multiple losses without complaint, internalizing each one as a personal failure. There was no medical diagnosis, only repetition and shame. Among the poor, childbirth was even more precarious. A farmer's wife might deliver in the same room where she cooked and slept, assisted by a neighbour with no formal training. She might return to work within days or even hours, her body still torn and raw. If the family could not afford another child, infanticide was sometimes practiced, quietly, without documentation, and rarely spoken of afterward. The methods were crude. The justification was economic. A baby who could not be fed was not allowed to live. The loss was not marked with ritual, only silence. The practice of mabiki, the thinning of infants, was especially common during times of famine or among families already burdened by debt. Female infants were more often targeted, as sons were needed to work, inherit, and carry on the family line. Daughters, though valued for their labour, were also seen as future dowry obligations. In a world where coin was scarce and land scarce still, the decision could be as simple as arithmetic. It was not hatred, it was math, and the system understood. Illegitimate children occupied another uncertain space. For elites, they were both a complication and a convenience. A lord might father children through concubines, courtesans, or servants. If the child was a son and the household had no heir, he might be legitimized, granted a name, a place in the family, and a carefully managed story. If there were already heirs, or if the mother's status was deemed too low, the child might be acknowledged but never elevated, or he might be ignored altogether, raised by the mother in obscurity, his origin a matter of village gossip and private shame. Daughters born out of wedlock had even fewer prospects. They might be married off to lower-ranking men, sent to distant relatives, or sold into domestic service. Their value lay not in inheritance, but in utility. A beautiful daughter might be trained as a courtesan, her face becoming a commodity to balance the stain of her birth. An unattractive one might spend her life washing linens for people who refused to meet her eyes. Either way, her name would not travel far. For commoners, the situation was less formal, but no less constrained. A child born without a father's acknowledgement might be absorbed into the household if the mother's parents allowed it, or raised under a fabricated story about a dead husband. In small villages, reputations travelled faster than truth. A woman who bore a child alone might be avoided, pitied, or quietly propositioned. Her status would change, even if her behaviour did not. The act of giving birth without a ring or a name made her vulnerable, in ways the law never needed to articulate. Inheritance law shaped more than family trees. It shaped behaviour. A man with multiple wives or concubines had to manage their offspring with precision, determining who would inherit, who would marry whom, who would be written into the ledger, and who would not. Mistakes could result in feuds, dishonour, or fragmentation of estates. A wife whose child was suspected of being illegitimate could lose everything. A concubine whose son rose too quickly could provoke jealousy that ended in exile or worse. Bloodlines were currency, and every drop had to be accounted for. The concern with bloodlines was not confined to the elite. Even among farmers and merchants, property needed to be passed, names needed to be carried, land needed to stay in the family. A man without sons might adopt a nephew, or, as noted earlier, he might adopt a son-in-law, Mukoyoshi, who would take his daughter's hand and his surname, preserving the illusion of continuity. These adoptions were practical arrangements, not sentimental gestures. They served the same purpose as reproduction, to hold the structure together. Women in this system were both central and peripheral. Central because nothing moved without their labour, their pregnancies, their careful management of home and child. Peripheral because their own names, identities and preferences were secondary to the needs of the household. A woman might bear 10 children and see none of them carry her name. She might spend decades ensuring the success of a family into which she had married as a stranger. She might die in that household, buried in the family plot, remembered as the second wife, or the one who bore sons, her own story a footnote to someone else's. Reproductive failure, when it occurred, was a quiet undoing. A woman who could not conceive might be blamed, pitied, or quietly replaced. If she held some favour, she might be allowed to remain as a secondary figure, managing the household while a concubine took on the work of childbirth. If she did not, she might be returned to her natal home. Her infertility recorded as cause. Her usefulness expired. There was no appeal. A womb that did not produce was a room that was no longer needed. The physical toll of constant childbirth was immense. Women who bore children every 1 or 2 years often suffered from prolapse, chronic infection, and physical exhaustion. Those conditions were rarely treated. Pain was normalized. Illness was considered divine punishment or personal failing. A woman who suffered too visibly might be scolded for weakness. One who suffered silently might be praised for virtue. Either way, her body continued to labour until it broke. Among all these births, miscarriages, adoptions and deaths, one theme remained constant: invisibility. The system required children, but it did not require mothers to be remembered. Most women who gave birth in feudal Japan left no written record. Their names appear only in family registries, if at all. Their voices do not appear in scrolls or treatises. Their opinions on motherhood, marriage, and the bodies they carried are unknown. What remains are patterns, statistical, architectural, unfeeling. Even stories of maternal love, when they appear, are filtered through male narratives. Novels, plays, paintings. The image of the self-sacrificing mother is a cultural motif, not a first-hand account. Her suffering is stylized, her death romanticized, her endurance admired only after it has ended. The child becomes a symbol, the mother becomes a shadow, and the structure moves forward undisturbed. In the end, all roles, wife, concubine, servant, courtesan, geisha, were drawn toward the same fate. No matter how different their lives, their costumes, their rituals, they shared a common destination: disappearance. Disappearance from the record, from the legal system, from the memory of the household once their utility had passed. The blood they shed, the children they raised, the labour they gave, all of it folded into the continuity of names that were never theirs. If you were a woman of no particular note, your name may not survive a single generation. You may have been born in a farming village where records were kept in memory, not on paper. You may have worked in a kitchen or a tea house or a back room that no longer exists. You may have borne children who forgot the sound of your voice, or none at all. The moments that shaped your life, your first bleeding, your first unwanted touch, your first brush with something that felt like longing, were not written down. No poet celebrated them. No court scribe deemed them worthy of record. You moved through rooms, bore expectations, survived seasons, and when you were gone, the world went on. The erasure of everyday lives, especially those lived in the body, is not accidental. It is a consequence of structure. Feudal Japan, like most societies built on hierarchy, kept meticulous records of land, lineage, and law. It did not, as a rule, record emotion, disobedience, or pain unless they disrupted order. A lord's concubine might appear in a family registry if she bore a son. A geisha might be immortalized in a woodblock print if her beauty was commercially valuable. A monk's scandal might be preserved in temple chronicles if it required administrative intervention. But the woman who scrubbed laundry in silence, who endured violation without recourse, who loved someone she was not allowed to name, she left no trace. Sexual history in particular disappears easily. It is lived privately, guarded by shame, and often hidden by those with the power to write history. The desires of the poor, the abused, the queer, the voiceless, these are not lost, they are excluded, and what survives in their place are structures, laws, rituals, expectations. We know how a noble woman's marriage was arranged, but not how she felt on her wedding night. We know the penalties for adultery, but not how often it occurred. We know the scripts, but not the unscripted moments, the stolen glances, the suppressed shudders, the whispered warnings passed from one servant to another behind a closed screen. What is left behind is performance, a courtesan's carefully practiced laugh, a wife's dutiful bow, a monk's stoic silence. These gestures, repeated thousands of times by thousands of different people, become the language through which power is maintained. They are visible, they are expected, they are misread again and again as contentment. But beneath them lies a more complicated truth, one of exhaustion, resignation, adaptation. The performance was never for the performer. It was for the system watching from all sides. Even those closest to visibility were not truly seen. The most celebrated courtesan still belonged to the house that trained her. The most favoured concubine could be replaced in a single night. The samurai page, elevated by attention, was still subject to dismissal the moment he aged out of usefulness. The geisha, praised for her refinement, could be discarded if her sponsor fell into debt. Their value was conditional, their legacy ornamental, their real selves, the ones behind the painted smiles and elaborate bows, were never formally introduced. Women's histories, in particular, were fragmented by design. In the household system, a woman's name changed with marriage, and often again with age or status. Her voice, if recorded at all, was filtered through male authors, male scribes, male memory. Her letters, if she wrote them, were rarely preserved unless they were scandalous. Her opinions, if she shared them, were often reframed as anecdotes, quaint, emotional, dismissible, and if she lived quietly, obediently, without scandal or flair, she became part of the background, another obedient daughter, another faithful wife, another mother who bled to death between seasons and was never named again. The queer histories of feudal Japan face an even deeper layer of disappearance. While relationships between men were sometimes acknowledged, particularly in samurai and monastic circles, they were framed as roles, not identities. They were permitted in youth, condemned in excess, ignored in silence. Relationships between women were largely erased altogether, not because they were non-existent, but because they were considered irrelevant. female intimacy, desire, and pleasure had no legal or political consequence, and so they vanished from the written record, dismissed as unthreatening or unimportant. Invisibility, in this case, was not safety, it was erasure. Peasant lives were equally ephemeral. Outside of temple records and tax documents, the poor left little that could be traced. A tenant farmer's wife might labour for 40 years without her name ever being spoken outside her village. A servant might endure 5 pregnancies, 3 dismissals, and 1 miscarriage in a shed behind the main house, all of it unrecorded. These women died as they lived, quiet, necessary, and forgotten. Their bodies fed the structure. Their stories did not survive it. Art and literature, though more generous than legal codes, still fail to preserve much of this world. The romanticized images of courtesans and geisha, the noble sacrifices of mothers and wives, the tragic monks and loyal pages, all of these were stylized, symbolic, and carefully edited. They reveal something, but not everything. They suggest emotion, but often obscure experience. The women who actually lived those lives might not recognize themselves in the scrolls. Their laughter was less graceful. Their nights were longer. Their choices were fewer. Control was maintained not only through law, but through silence, the kind that settled in the gaps between expectation and reality. A woman who wanted something she could not have was taught to lower her gaze. A man who strayed from the path of duty was reminded of his place. A servant who cried too loudly was warned that neighbours might hear. The quiet was not passive, it was enforced, and over time it became internal. Entire generations learned not to ask, not to speak, not to remember too clearly. Survival required it. In this silence, the body was the only witness. It carried the scars, the stretch marks, the fatigue. It remembered what could not be spoken. A woman might forget her mother's face, but not the ache of her 3rd miscarriage. A courtesan might forget the name of a former client, but not the way he grabbed her wrist too tightly. A monk might suppress his longing, but not the rhythm of the footsteps he listened for at night. These memories lived in bone and breath, not in writing, and yet, despite this overwhelming absence, there are traces. A discarded comb found buried in a garden, a poem scribbled in a margin, a record of rice owed to a woman who never married. These fragments, though incomplete, suggest a world that was lived fully, even if it was not remembered properly. They remind us that history is not made only by victors, rulers, or scribes. It is made by those who endure quietly, who perform convincingly, who vanish without ceremony. It is made by those whose names were never written down. The tragedy of these unspoken bodies is not just that they were forgotten, but that their forgetting was systematized. Their erasure was not the result of indifference, but of intention. The structure needed them, to bear children, to serve meals, to smile on command, but it did not need their memories. Their presence was vital. Their stories were disposable, and so they disappeared. If you listen closely to the histories that do survive, you can sometimes hear their absence, in the gaps between laws, in the contradictions of records, in the awkward justifications for silence. A woman is listed as a concubine, but has no death date. A page is praised for loyalty, but never mentioned again after 17. A geisha is described as retired, though no one knows where she went. These absences are not voids. They are shadows cast by people who were once real. And perhaps that is where understanding begins, not with the surviving names, but with those that were never recorded. Not with the laws, but with the lives that endured beneath them. Not with the painted fans and lacquered screens, but with the calluses on the hands that held them. History, after all, is not only what was written, it is also what was lived, quietly, painfully, invisibly. Now as the incense burns low and the tatami cools beneath the night air, the room is silent again. The household has long since settled. The guests have gone home. The robes have been folded, the lanterns extinguished. The woman who once slept here is gone, married off, dismissed, buried. No one remembers what she wanted. No one ever asked. The rules remain. So do the ledgers, the poetry, the punishments. But the people who lived inside them, the ones who bowed, who wept, who endured, are harder to find. What survives is the structure. What disappears, again and again, are the bodies that carried it. We know their expectations, we know their constraints. We know what they were told to do, what they were forbidden from saying. But their stories, their private joys, their hidden fears, their unspoken desires were never meant to last. And so we end as we began, with silence, with a room swept clean, with the faint scent of sandalwood fading into the night. That brings us to the end of tonight's episode, not one of passion nor transgression, but of structure, silence, and the many lives pressed flat beneath rules too old to question. In the sliding spaces of feudal Japan, sex was seldom about desire and almost never about choice. It was duty, economy, inheritance, and it left behind more absence than memory. If you'd like early access to more of these quiet explorations, ad-free audio of the episodes, or just want to support the show, there's a link to the Patreon in the description. Feel free to like, subscribe, or leave a comment with other historical topics you'd like to see explored. If you're listening on a podcast app, a rating or review helps more people find their way to these stories. And special thanks to the supporters who make this show possible, including our chroniclers, Andrew S. and Rich Davis. Sleep well.